And the manager just says, what's going on here? And this woman says, she won't let us sit down. We want to go and sit down.
The scene aired just once. By the time the credits rolled, the studio didn't erupt in applause the way it usually did. Instead, it fell into an uneasy silence. Crew members avoided eye contact, some staring at the floor as if movement itself felt wrong, others quietly wiping their eyes and pretending the lights were to blame. No one had expected that reaction. Not from a show built on laughter and not from a woman the world associated with joy. Viewers later called the episode unforgettable. Critics praised its courage and restraint. Awards followed, confirming that something rare and powerful had taken place. Yet she never watched it again. Not the reruns, not the clips shown at award ceremonies, not even decades later when time softened most memories. She refused. She said it was too close, too honest, too real. For someone who had spent her entire life making people laugh, this performance crossed a line she couldn't step back from. There was no punchline waiting to rescue her, no exaggerated movement to hide behind, no laughter to dissolve the tension. There was only truth. It exposed the contradiction at the center of her life. She could stand confidently in front of millions, but she couldn't sit alone and face the parts of herself that slipped through the act. Because this time, she wasn't playing a character. She was exposing something unfinished, something wounded. To understand why that moment hurt so deeply, you have to go back before the applause, before the stage lights, before anyone knew her name. Back to a childhood where laughter wasn't entertainment, it was survival. She entered the world already at a disadvantage. The people meant to protect her were barely holding themselves together. Trapped in cycles they couldn't escape, addiction filled the rooms where comfort should have lived. And promises were made only to be broken before they ever had a chance to matter. Stability was never guaranteed, love came inconsistently, and safety felt temporary, something that could vanish overnight without warning. She learned early that silence could be dangerous, that attention arrived unpredictably, and that affection could disappear just as quickly as it appeared, so she adapted. She became observant, learned to read the atmosphere of a room before it turned volatile, and paid close attention to moods that shifted without explanation. Somewhere along the way, she discovered something powerful. Laughter changed the air. She became quick, clever, and funny, not for applause, but for protection. If she made people smile, maybe they wouldn't argue. If they laughed, maybe they wouldn't leave. Laughter became armor light on the outside, heavy with purpose. Eventually, the responsibility her parents couldn't carry collapsed entirely, and someone else stepped in. A single figure offered consistency in a world built on unpredictability. There was no sudden comfort, no financial relief, no miracle. Waiting around the corner, there was still struggle, uncertainty, and fear. But there was something new, reliability. Meals happened when they could. Bedtime came without shouting. Love wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was steady. And sometimes, for a child on the edge of breaking, consistency is enough not to erase the damage, but to survive it. In a cramped room filled with strangers, noise, and constant uncertainty, she invented another version of herself. This version was everything she needed to survive. She was fearless where reality demanded caution, confident where life offered doubt, untouched by the fear that followed her everywhere else. She gave this imagined self a name, a personality, even a presence strong enough to feel real. It wasn't a game and it wasn't about attention. It was about breathing. It was about creating space in a world that felt too small and too heavy. What made it extraordinary was that the adults around her believed it. Not because the illusion was flawless, but because they needed something hopeful to believe in. In a boarding house filled with broken stories and people barely holding on, imagination wasn't childish, it was necessary. Those moments of pretend offered relief, not just for her, but for everyone watching, without realizing it. She was training herself. She learned how to shift her voice, adjust her posture, and transform her energy in seconds. She learned timing, character, and emotional control long before she ever heard the word performance. These weren't rehearsed lessons or planned exercises. They were instinctive responses to survival. Every switch between identities strengthened her awareness of rhythm and presence. The tools of performance were being built quietly, invisibly, shaped by necessity rather than ambition. Long before a stage ever found her, she was already learning how to step into someone else's skin and make them feel real. One sound changed everything. It wasn't applause or praise, and it didn't come from an audience. It came from imitation. Sitting quietly, she heard a voice echo through a movie theater, powerful and unmistakable, and something inside her clicked. She carried that sound home with her and repeated it again and again, not for attention, But for curiosity, she practiced until the pitch felt natural, until her breathing aligned perfectly, until control replaced effort. At the time, it felt like play, like a harmless obsession a child might grow out of. But she didn't. Years later, that sound would become part of her identity, a signature that audiences would recognize instantly. What began as copying slowly turned into mastery, and mastery opened doors she never imagined. Without training, without instruction, she was building vocal strength and control that most performers spend years trying to achieve. She was learning how to command attention with nothing but sound. She didn't understand the significance of it then. She couldn't have known that these private experiments were shaping her future. But even in those early moments, something important was happening. She was learning that her voice could fill a room, change its energy, and make people feel something. Long before she met an audience, she was already preparing for one. Talent doesn't matter when survival is at stake. No amount of potential can overcome a locked door. An opportunity doesn't exist without access. When the moment finally came, when the path forward briefly revealed itself, she couldn't afford to take the first step. The cost wasn't enormous by most standards. But for her, it was impossible. For most people, that would have been the end of the story, a dream postponed indefinitely, filed away under responsibility and reality. She came close to accepting that outcome. The disappointment didn't explode all at once. It settled quietly, the kind that teaches you not to hope too loudly. Then, unexpectedly, help arrived without explanation. There was no name attached, no demand for repayment, no expectation of recognition, just enough to move forward. That single gesture changed the direction of her life. But it also planted something deeper. It taught her that luck carries weight. That opportunity creates obligation. She understood, even then, that success wouldn't belong to her alone. It would come with responsibility to honor the chance she'd been given and to one day pass it on. That lesson stayed with her long after the money was spent, shaping the way she moved through the world. It wasn't just about escaping poverty anymore. It was about proving that the faith placed in her wasn't wasted. One class changed everything. She walked in unsure and walked out transformed. In that room, something unlocked. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't cautious or shrinking herself to fit the space. She was electric. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was pretending to be someone else. She felt like she was becoming who she had always been. Her voice carried. Her presence filled the room. People noticed. Teachers paid attention. For someone who had spent her life adapting to survive, this was unfamiliar territory. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Choosing this path meant walking away from the safety of something practical, something sensible. It meant risking failure publicly instead of quietly. That fear was real. But staying scared felt worse. Staying silent felt like betrayal. So she made a choice. She chose the unknown over certainty. She chose risk over comfort. And unexpectedly, the unknown responded. Doors began to open. Encouragement replaced doubt. What once felt reckless began to feel inevitable. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving circumstances. She was actively choosing herself. Fame didn't arrive quickly, and it didn't arrive gently. Before recognition came shared rooms and borrowed hope. Late nights followed by early rejection. She worked whenever she could, taking jobs that barely paid but kept her afloat. She auditioned when exhaustion allowed, learning to perform through disappointment. The city didn't care who she was or how hard she worked. The industry was indifferent, unforgiving, and crowded with people just as desperate. Progress came in inches, not leaps, but momentum builds quietly. It gathers in unseen moments. In small risks taken repeatedly, sometimes all it takes is one moment, something ridiculous, unexpected, almost accidental. A joke lands, a laugh breaks through. What seemed insignificant suddenly becomes a door. A single performance turns into leverage. People start remembering her name. Invitations follow. Opportunities whisper instead of shout. It doesn't feel like victory at first. It feels like relief. Like proof that the struggle wasn't pointless. And once attention arrives, even briefly, everything changes. Not because the work is finished, but because the path forward finally becomes visible. When the spotlight finally hit, it didn't flicker. It stayed. She wasn't just popular anymore, she was essential. Audiences didn't tune in casually. They showed up because she was there. Shows survived because of her presence, and when she stepped away, they collapsed almost immediately. That kind of success is rare, but it comes with weight. Expectations grow heavier. Pressure becomes constant. Responsibility stops being optional. She quickly learned that leadership wasn't about ego or applause. It was about protection. about making sure the people around her felt safe enough to take risks, to fail, to experiment. That often meant absorbing tension so others didn't have to. It meant stepping in when things fell apart and stepping back when credit was being handed out. She had to make decisions that weren't popular, conversations that weren't comfortable, and calls that put the health of the work above personal feelings. Success didn't give her freedom the way people assume it does. It tied her more tightly to everyone depending on her. She carried the pressure quietly, knowing that one misstep could affect dozens of careers beyond her own. Being irreplaceable didn't feel triumphant, it felt heavy, but she carried it anyway, because she understood that what they were building together mattered more than her own comfort. One night, she stepped into a role that wasn't safe. There was no exaggeration to soften it, no shield of comedy to hide behind, just honesty. She stripped everything back and played the moment straight, letting the pain speak without interruption. When the camera stopped, something unusual happened. No one clapped, they couldn't. The silence filled the room, thick and heavy, saying more than applause ever could. Everyone understood they had witnessed something raw. Viewers later praised the performance. Critics called it brave, even necessary. But she couldn't revisit it. She never wanted to see it again, because it wasn't acting. It was memory. It pulled from wounds she had spent a lifetime learning how to cover with humor. Performing it felt like reopening a door she had carefully kept shut. On screen, it looked controlled. Inside, it was devastating. That moment broke a rule she lived by. Comedy was supposed to protect people, not expose them. And it exposed her. Even though the world applauded her courage, she carried the weight privately, knowing she had crossed into something too personal to repeat, while audiences laughed. Her life fractured quietly. Behind the scenes, love struggled under the strain of ambition and family suffered under constant pressure. Publicly, she fought when lies threatened her integrity, refusing to let her name be distorted by careless narratives. Privately, the battles were harder. Addiction crept into her family and demanded impossible decisions. She fought for her children, not with words, but with action. Rehab centers, ultimatums, distance, and painful boundaries. She made choices that hurt deeply, choices that risked being misunderstood, because not making them would have hurt even more. Through it all, she kept showing up. She worked, she performed, she smiled, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. She believed responsibility didn't end when things became complicated. If anything, that's when it mattered most. The audience never saw those nights of fear or exhaustion. They saw laughter. And that was intentional. She had learned long ago that her job wasn't to share her pain, but to hold space for others to forget theirs even when her own life felt like it was unraveling. She didn't redefine comedy by being loud or flashy. She did it by being human. Decades passed, generations changed, the industry evolved, but her work remained, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. People don't remember flawlessness, they remember truth. They remember how something made them feel. She made the world laugh, not to escape pain, but to transform it into something survivable. Her strength was never about dominance or control. It was about endurance, about showing up again and again, even when life tried to take more than it gave back. Her legacy isn't just the awards or the ratings or the history she made. It's the permission she gave others to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, to keep going. She reminded people that laughter and pain can exist in the same breath. That joy doesn't erase suffering, but it can sit beside it. And that's why her story still matters. Because long after the applause fades, what remains is connection. And she gave that to millions.